Hi, this is Wendy from Wendy's Classic Corner, and today we're in the beautiful Collier Township at the Woodville Plantation. Were you aware of this post-Revolutionary War home and all its historic ties? No? Well, join me and let's see what we can discover. So we're here with Rob today. Rob, can you tell us a little bit about what you do here at Woodville?
Well, welcome, Wendy. We're glad to have you here. My name is Rob Windhorst, and I'm the Vice President and Historian of the Neville House Associates. They are the organization that runs and administers and preserves the Woodville House, the home of John and Presley Neville.
And you sometimes do tours here as well?
Yeah, I started out, hard to believe, but 32 years ago with the organization doing tours, and I sort of evolved through a number of different positions, including president, and now I'm very comfortably in my role as historian here. So,
well, it's great that we get to have you for this segment. We appreciate it. And so can you tell me about what year this, I mean, I know the house went through transitions, but about what year the main part of the house was built?
So we know through dendroarchaeology that the timbers for the main part of the house were cut sometime around 1775, and that makes sense because that's when John Neville first comes to Western Pennsylvania. If you look at the house behind us, the two dormers are sort of off-center. And that's very unusual for 18th century architecture, particularly Tidewater architecture. But if you look and you take this house back to the very original portions of the house, roughly just outside of the left lattice work there and in between those two dormers over there, if you take away those other parts of the house, that's the original portion of the house. And it's interesting because then once all those other pieces are stripped away, those two dormers are perfectly centered.
And so you mentioned John Neville. And what John Neville, who is he and why did he come here?
He comes here from Winchester, Virginia in the early 1770s. And he buys his first properties in the area, the 300 acres that is now, the 2.5 acres are left, but the original 300 acres that were part of Woodville.
And he was part of like the military, right?
Mm-hmm.
So he came here for a military purpose?
Yeah, in the early 1770s, the British had abandoned Fort Pitt. Fort Pitt was the largest British fort in North America. And by the late 1760s, it had outlived its usefulness, and the British simply walked away from it. Well, the two colonies, Pennsylvania and Virginia, both had designs on making Pittsburgh part of their territory. Virginia, I think, had the right idea. Rather than squabbling about it in the legislature and through the courts, Virginia decides to send about 200 troops under the command of John Neville. He comes up and takes command of the fort and declares this Virginia property.
All right, and that now is nowadays, part of that is nowadays what we have as the Fort Pitt Museum.
Correct, yeah. If you visit Fort Pitt Museum in Pittsburgh, that would have been what John Neville was in command of.
Okay, and who actually built this house?
So one of the things that we've come to discover over the last few years is that we believe that this house was built by the enslaved people that John Neville brought here in the early 1770s. When we get inside, we're going to talk a little bit more about the exceptional woodwork done by these not just field labor, but craftsmen that were part of this enslaved community, which, by the way, is the largest community of African Americans west of the Allegheny Mountains prior to 1810. It's a very significant piece of African American history right here on this property.
And we are going to talk a little bit more about the enslaved as we go forward in this segment. And one other thing I think you mentioned to me is like you have some crops here that would be similar to crops that they would plant at this point in time.
Yeah, that's one of my very early projects when I was here. One of the very first projects I was assigned to was to restore the kitchen gardens. And if you look just over your shoulder there, we have the fully restored kitchen garden. We call it our demonstration kitchen garden. We grow 18th century species of crops. We even have rare breed chickens that were probably the most ubiquitous and most predominant breed of chicken. They're called Dominics, and you may see them roaming around the yard as we walk over there. We've discovered the original location of the privy or the outhouse, and we've restored that. And then inside the gardens nowadays, we have, I think we actually have some pretty good things growing over there, and you'll be able to see those in a minute.
Awesome. I can't wait to check them out. And we have a lot more to talk about, so we're going to go on to the next part.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, Rob, so we're over here in the yard and we're going to talk a little bit about the Whiskey Rebellion. So a lot of people may not know what the Whiskey Rebellion is. Can you give us a little bit of information about that?
So it's very difficult to compress it into a minute or two, but we'll do our best.
Okay.
Following the Revolution, the states and the United States collectively had accumulated quite a bit of debt. One of Alexander Hamilton's ideas as Secretary of Treasury was to institute the very first internal tax on American goods, particularly on whiskey. Out here in Western Pennsylvania, where whiskey was looked upon not only as a commodity, but as a means of barter and a sort of a surrogate cash, the farmers felt it was more than unfair to them because they were being charged per gallon. Larger distillers were able to pay a flat rate, which was much less per gallon than what the farmers were paying. Long story short, following a lot of attacks on some of the tax collectors, it eventually culminates in them attacking the home of the head of the tax collectors, who was John Neville.
Yeah, so this is how John Neville comes into the story. And we're talking, they came not to this particular house, but to what was his Bower Hill house.
Correct, and in the distance behind us, you can see up on the hill up there, that's Bower Hill. So on this 1,500-acre property, you had two homes. You had John Neville's house at Bower Hill, and then you had Woodville down here in the valley. That is where the Whiskey Rebellion essentially begins during July 15th, 16th, and 17th of 1794.
And it happened, I think, because they were trying to serve a writ on one of the farmers.
Yeah, on July 15th, David Lennox, who was a federal marshal, had served writs or court orders to appear in court in Philadelphia for farmers that hadn't registered their stills and hadn't paid the taxes. They go to serve one on William Miller, who was an acquaintance and a good friend of John Neville. William Miller, as he referred to it, was felt so incensed at seeing Neville leading this federal revenue inspector and federal marshal to his house. At some point, one of the field hands, a gun is fired. We don't know if it was actually aimed at anybody, but Neville and Lennox are not going to stick around to find out. The next day, on July 16th, about 50 farmers march into the compound up on Bower Hill and demand that Neville show himself, turn over the tax records. Neville asks them to leave 3 times, and then something very interesting happens. He sounds a horn from inside the house, and from behind the farmers, from the outbuildings, the enslaved people have been armed, and they open fire on the farmers, killing one of them, wounding 2 of them, and driving them back.
And they're not just going to sit there and be like, oh, okay, we'll just go back
No,
to
they're
our houses. So they amass a lot more people at this point.
yeah, roughly 500 farmers gather that night, and the next morning they march back out to Bower Hill. This time they don't march into the compound, rather they surround the house. They're under the command of a former Revolutionary War officer, James McFarland, and they march out to confront Neville. Neville at this point realizes this is probably not a good idea for him to stick around, so he retreats to a thicket nearby to watch what happens.
They did also let the family, at one point, the farmers let the family come, and they wound up coming back up here.
Yeah, we think that's one of the only things that saved the Woodville house. During the middle of the second day's battle, there's a flag of truce flown, and Kirkpatrick asks if the women and children would be allowed to leave and take refuge here at Woodville, which they were granted permission.
What was the fate of the Bower Hill house?
Well, ultimately, during the course of the battle, at one point, somebody said they saw a flag of truce come out of the window. James McFarland, who's roughly 100 and 150 yards off in the woods, steps out from behind a large tree and is instantly dispatched by, of all the horrific ways to go, a musket ball to the groin. He expires within a minute, and this so incenses the farmers that they put the torch to not only the outbuildings, but every building on the property, including the main house.
And just real quick, a fun fact as well in the footnote of this is they did eventually contact George Washington and tell us a little fun fact about George Washington.
So probably the most interesting fact, as Washington gets word that there's been an attack on not only a federal marshal, but his federal inspector of revenue, John Neville, he declares that the western counties are in open rebellion. He raises a 13,000-man army of militia, and they march out in 2 columns to Pittsburgh. The interesting thing about that is that George Washington, at the head of this 13,000-man army, is commanding more troops during the Whiskey Rebellion than at any point in time during his military career during the Revolution.
Oh, so awesome. A little fun fact about George Washington, a little bit about the Whiskey Rebellion and Pittsburgh and Neville's tie to it. And I think next we're going to go on to find out some more really interesting information about the properties around here.
Absolutely. Let's take a walk.
Okay. Okay, Rob, so we're in the cabin here. I think you called this a demonstration cabin. So tell us a little bit about what this cabin was for.
So this is a reconstructed building. This is typical of what the enslaved people that lived and worked here on the property would have lived in.
And how many people would live in a small cabin like this?
So a small cabin like this is going to hold probably anywhere between 10 and 15 people. It's usually going to have a whole family unit. You're going to have grandparents, parents, and then the kids are going to sleep in the loft area up above there. The adults would probably sleep on pallets or pieces of wood that they're going to have on the floor, and then they'll put their bedrolls out over top of that. Generally, they're going to be a straw mattress with a blanket of some sort. Not very pleasant sleeping conditions, not very pleasant living conditions. And
you mentioned too that it would be very hot in the summer.
Yeah, if you see up above us there, you can see some of the daylight shining through the rafters. In the winter months, it's going to be unbearably cold. They do have a fireplace here, but the fireplace, even in the winter months, is not going to do much. Although I will say 10 people in a building this size is going to add to the warmth. That's not going to help you in the summer months where it's going to be unbearably hot in here. Just horrific living conditions. These cabins were generally sort of temporary living.
Yeah.
They're sort of the equivalent of the modern day mobile home. If they were going to work at one of the more distant parts of the farm for a long period of time, they would disassemble the cabins, move them out to that part of the farm, and then reassemble them there. And then when they needed to go somewhere else, they'd disassemble them and move them to a new location.
And we've mentioned John Neville a couple times now in the enslaved population that he brought along, but it does seem strange in Pennsylvania that they would have enslaved people.
Yeah, a lot of people ask that. They say, you know, I can't believe that there were slaves in this far north. Pennsylvania, interestingly enough, is the first state to pass an Emancipation Act. They passed in 1780. They passed the Gradual Emancipation Act. Now, what that does is it doesn't free all of the enslaved people immediately, but rather if you were born to a family that was enslaved after February of 1780, you would be required to stay in slavery for the next 26 years. Eventually, they lowered that to 23 years. Slavery really doesn't then disappear from Pennsylvania until roughly, I believe, the 1840s.
Yeah, and it's not like John Neville he didn't originate in Pennsylvania. He came from the South, and so he brought his slaves with him. And you said, I think at one point, that this was the largest African-American community.
Yeah, this is a very significant piece of African American history. We have worked with Duquesne University, the University of Pittsburgh, and one of the things that we have come up with as we've done more and more research into trying to give this community of people a name and an identity that's been lost to history. We've been able to identify 82 individuals that lived and worked as part of this enslaved community. One of the other great things that we've been able to do is we've started to find names for the folks that lived and worked here, when they were born, when they passed away, and some of their occupations. And we're going to talk a little bit when we get into the main house about a man who worked in house service for the Presley Neville family, Henry Holt.
Okay, I'm looking forward to hearing that. And the very last thing about this, John Neville did on his death emancipate all his slaves, correct?
Yeah, we believe that in 1803, when he passes away, he emancipates most of his enslaved people. We know there's a couple of documents, one that we just recently uncovered, where Presley Neville talks about some of the enslaved people that had previously been manumitted. And this is in 1806. So we know that by that point in time, Presley's in the process of releasing a lot of his enslaved people. Eventually, as he moves to the Ohio Territory, where there isn't slavery, he winds up freeing all of his enslaved people as well.
Yeah, and I don't know if we mentioned Presley is John's son.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
I'm
not
sorry.
sure if we said that.
I should have said that. Yeah.
But anyhow, now we're going to move into the house, and we have a lot of interesting things to talk about in the house as well. So Rob, we're in the room called the Passage. Can you tell us a little bit about what this room would be used for?
So the Passage, today we have hallways that connect one room to another in our houses. The Passage was a room in and of itself. The Passage is going to be used for two primary purposes. Number one, it is going to be a place where you can discard cloaks, coats, anything that boots, dirty boots. But the more important function of a Passage is this is where they are going to welcome visitors to the house. So if you're part of the 85% of the people in Western Pennsylvania that are part of the poor working farmers, you would certainly be given a meal. You're going to go to the kitchen for that. And then if you need a place to stay, you're going to be put up in one of the outbuildings like the barn for the evening. If you're part of the gentry class, though, only then would you be welcomed into the parlor or the dining room, the more private family spaces of the house.
And people would sort of just travel along and stop at random houses like this house as they're traveling along on their way.
Yeah, one traveler in the 18th century wrote that this General Neville's house was, quote, the only house of substance on the road between Washington and Pittsburgh. So this road right outside the door here, present-day Route 50, is, it's been in existence for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's a prehistoric Native American trail that was known as the Catfish Path.
Oh, wow.
Connected the town of Catfish, which was where Washington, PA is today, with Pittsburgh and Queen Aliquippastown, which is where Baden and Ambridge are today.
And some of the other things I noticed in this room, now you talked a little bit about the enslaved people and all the things they did in the house, and there's some woodworking and so forth that is very fine that you said that they would have done.
So we know that when John Neville leaves and Presley Neville leaves to go fight in the Revolution in the early 1776, he leaves Pittsburgh. None of these homes are built. When he returns, Presley Neville returns in November of 1782, and John Neville returns in January of 1783. Not only is this house built, but all of the outbuildings and the Bower Hill house are built as well. So we know, the only people we know for certain that are in occupation here during those ensuing 7 years are the people of the enslaved community. Now, the interesting thing about that is, as you look around this room and you see this incredible woodwork, all the detail work on the balustrades and the handrail and the newel post, and even things like the strap hinges that you see and all the ironwork on the door, These are all things that we believe were done by these very skilled enslaved people.
And one of the other things I noticed in this room is all these pictures on the wall. So as you said, I believe this up here is a silhouette of John Neville himself.
So this is the only likeness we know of John Neville. It's a silhouette, and you can see his profile there. We do have a picture, a painting of his daughter, Amelia, in the early part of the 19th century, and she's a little bit older in age, but she very much looks like her father. So we often tell visitors, when you take a look at that picture, you can sort of get a really good idea. She looks a lot like him. So we get a real good idea of what he might have looked like. Some of the other pictures that you see around here, we've got some of their famous compatriots from the Revolution. You've got Anthony Wayne. Anthony Wayne was in service here as the commander of the U.S. Army from 1792 to 96. That army was headquartered at Fort Fayette in Pittsburgh during that time, and he was certainly a friend of John Neville. Over here we have a picture of Benjamin Lincoln. He was the commanding officer that served with both John and Presley Neville at the Battle of Charleston in 1780 when both men were captured by the British. And then, of course, in the middle you have the Marquis de Lafayette. And this picture would have been very near and dear to the Neville family. Presley Neville, when the Marquis de Lafayette arrived in 1777 at Valley Forge to serve the American cause during the Revolution. Presley Neville and John Neville were both there at Valley Forge, but Presley Neville was called upon to be the Marquis's aide-de-camp, and he served him throughout the war.
He's one of my favorite figures in the Revolutionary War. I love him. And we also have some pictures on the other wall of George Washington as well.
George Washington obviously had grown up. He and John Neville grew up in the same area in Fairfax and Frederick and Winchester, in that area. We know that they were surveyors together when they were young men. And later on in life, a lot of George Washington's correspondence between Presley, who was George Washington's land agent out here in western Pennsylvania, and between him and John Neville, we know that they were certainly very good friends. There's one reference we know in Washington's letters where he's writing to Presley about a land deal, and he says, "Oh, by the way, I heard that your father was in Philadelphia. I'm surprised he didn't come to see me."
Aww.
So we know that the families were very close.
That's nice.
Yes.
And I think we are moving out of the John Neville. We're going to start moving out of the John Neville era, and we're going into the Presley Neville era in our next room.
So as we leave this room, which was the most original, about 90% of this room is original to the Neville time period and when the house was built. As we get into the parlor, you'll see we'll transition into a little more updated for the federal period, which is 1780 to 1820, and you'll see a little more of Presley Neville in that room.
Excellent. Let's go check it out.
All right, let's do that.
So we're now in this room that we talk a little bit more about Presley Neville, because you're not really sure exactly when this was brought, but you think more it's around his time that this was added on.
Yeah, we know that the rest of the house from the passage over was built, that was the initial house. This room has a little bit different foundation. It's a little more sturdy. It's a stone foundation, but we're pretty sure that this was built sometime very early in Presley's occupation. Originally, this room had windows very similar to what you see on these two walls on all of the walls. So this would have been a very bright, very airy, open room. I think it would have been very beautiful in the period. This is what they would have referred to as their best room. So as you come in here, it's meant to impress. All of their fine things such as wallpapers and carpet, fine furniture, upholstered furniture, all is going to be in here to impress visitors.
Only the high-end visitors, not those farmers. They're not allowed in this room. And you went through like quite a task to try to make the carpet and the wallpaper as authentic as possible.
Yeah, the wallpapers actually are a reproduction. They're reproduced by the original company in England that made the original wallpaper for this house. And that's pretty impressive when you think about it. They were able to reproduce this for us. We have an original piece right behind the door over there. The carpets are actually made by Wilton in England. Wilton was one of the major carpet manufacturers in the 18th century. and they had a very limited amount of patterns that you could choose from. So we're pretty sure this is very similar to what was in here in the 18th century. We know that between John Neville's inventory at Bower Hill and the second owner of the house, Christopher Cowan, his inventory in the early part of the 19th century, we know that a lot of the things that you see in here now, it's furnished to those two inventories. So it sort of bridges the gap between when Presley Neville leaves in 1815 and when Christopher Cowan moves into the house around that same time period.
Yeah, speaking of Christopher Cowan, so he actually added even more onto the house because there's 2 rooms because he had a slew of children.
Yeah.
So he had to add some rooms onto the house, actually off this room.
Yeah, so the rooms that you see over this shoulder here, he added 2 rooms over there. We presume one was for the boys, one was for the girls. He's the guy that really made the house look the way it does today. Pretty much all you see here was added by Christopher Cowan in the first 10 years of his occupation.
And he has this very beautiful piano that you wanted to mention.
Yeah, so Cowan, we know from his inventory when he passes away in 1835, he lists everything that's part of his estate, including the 300 acres that was here, the house, and all of its contents. The total for those those things was $2,500. Interestingly enough, of the $2,500, the most expensive item in his inventory is the pianoforte, which is $250. It's interesting, we were able to acquire this pianoforte that was made by Muzio Clementi. Clementi is the man that invented the modern piano mechanism that we still have today. And so this is one of his original instruments that dates to about 1810.
But no relation to Roberto Clemente.
No relation to Roberto Clemente.
All right, so we're going to learn a little bit more about Christopher Cowan in our next room.
Yes.
Okay, let's go check it out.
Thanks.
Now, I know we came in here, the dining room, to talk about Christopher Cowan, but before that, you had mentioned you had identified some of the enslaved folks here, and I think one of the people you identified was somebody who worked in the dining room?
Sure. Just very recently, we identified the man that worked in the dining room. His name was Henry Holt. We know this from an emancipation letter that Presley Neville wrote in 1807. And he refers to some of the duties that he did. He refers that he played the violin. He gives us a description that he's about 5'7" or 5'8". We know that he was born of enslaved parents, and that he worked as part of the waitstaff here in the dining room.
And on to, we're going to skip forward a little bit to Christopher Cowan, because he pretty much added this room, at least enclosed it with the kitchen.
Yeah, the kitchen was originally a separate building. When Christopher Cowan moves in 1815, he expands the house from right about where this sort of edge right here is, and extends the house out about 8 feet and connects it to the kitchen. So what that does, it allows him to get his meals maybe a little bit hotter. They're being brought through this door rather than all the way along the front of the house and in through that door. But he really reconfigures the southern end of the house to look the way it does today.
Oh, and speaking of Christopher Cowan, we do have an actual portrait of him. So tell us a little, Christopher Cowan, I don't think is very well known. Tell us a little bit about him.
No, I always say Christopher Cowan is Pittsburgh's best kept secret. He was truly Pittsburgh's first industrialist. Cowan moves to Pittsburgh from Ireland around 1800, and he sets up the very first cut nail making machine in Pittsburgh. He also sets up a slitting and rolling mill, which stamps iron into pieces that can be fed into machines that stamp them into things like shovels, saws, axes, things like that. We even think that this fireplace surround that you see here was possibly made in Christopher Cowan's foundry. So for whatever reason he came to Pittsburgh, he's the right guy at the right place at the right time. So Cowan is a very, very wealthy man. He's one of the wealthiest men in Pittsburgh during his era. He comes from wealth originally. We know that because he brought with him this very fine example of a Manchester clock that was made in Manchester, England, sometime around the 1780s. So he brings that with him. He winds up buying Woodville in 1815. and he moves here for the next 20 years with his family.
Didn't he have a connection with John Neville? Didn't he marry the niece or something?
He did. He married into the family. He was married to John Neville's wife, Winnie, her sister's daughter, married Christopher Cowan.
Oh, so there was already a connection as well.
Absolutely.
Christopher Cowan, we need to get more information out there about him. Not well known as he should have been.
And as I said, everybody knows Frick, Carnegie, all those guys that were 100 years later. Christopher Cowan is truly Pittsburgh's first industrialist.
Right, and he had something to do with these fireplaces. There's something you want to tell us about the fireplaces here?
So the fireplaces are on an angle. We get a lot of questions like, why are they on the angle? Well, one of the primary reason is it allows you to put 3 fireboxes into one chimney. It's a way of conserving brick. So this fireplace connects to the one that we saw in the kitchen and then into the one that's in the bedroom that's right around the corner here.
And that bedroom around the corner was Christopher Cowan's bedroom that he probably, I assume he took some of the dining room because you said the dining room used to be long.
Yeah, the dining room used to run this way, and then he divided it down the middle this way and broke it into 2 long, thin rooms, one of which is his bedroom.
And it's unusual for them to have a bedroom on the first floor at that time.
Yeah, we're not sure why his bedroom's down here on the first floor. We do know that it gives him access to a fireplace. It also gives him access to really good cross ventilation. And then the third thing is his housekeeper, Mrs. Brittingham, had a little suite off of the room there, which gave her access not only to the kitchen and the people that worked in the kitchen, but also to the children's rooms and then the main house itself.
All right, and I think that's everything we have in the house.
Yeah.
So, this is most of the tour, and I think we're just going to finish up in the,
Museum shop.
The museum shop. Okay, excellent.
Sure, let's take a walk.
Let's go. All right, so we're in the museum.
Museum gift shop.
The museum gift shop. And so tell us a little bit about, first of all, we've only gone over a little bit of what you do on the tour.
Oh, there's much more on the tour.
A lot more history. So if somebody wanted to come take a tour, how would they do that?
We are open Sundays from 1 till 4, but the grounds are open every day. We have a self-guided walking tour of the property, which if you can make it down during the weekdays, we're happy to have you here and you can take the self-guided tour, but would love to have you come by on Sundays as well.
Yeah, excellent. And do you have a website, social media?
Yeah, we just have a newly revamped website. I encourage everybody to go to it. It is every bit as good as all of the major historical sites in the United States. It is www.woodville-experience.org.
Okay, and social media, you have Facebook or any of the social medias?
We do.
You're not sure about that one?
I'm not sure which. Yeah.
Probably just look up.
Yeah, look up Woodville. Woodville, and it'll bring everything up. I would encourage people to come to some of our special events. The next 2 that we have on Juneteenth, we have our celebration of the Juneteenth holiday. July 20th is our major festival of the year. It's the Whiskey Rebellion Day. We have a very big thing this year. Brady Kreitzer, who wrote one of the books on the Whiskey Rebellion right here. He is going to be moderating a debate between myself and Clay Kilgore, who's the director of the Washington County Historical Society. So we're looking forward to a little lively debate with Brady moderating and Farmers versus Federalists.
Oh, excellent.
We'll see who wins.
Definitely have to come out for that, July 20th.
July 20th.
And Juneteenth, if we can get this out in time to let people know about that.
And
you have that every year.
Yeah, we do. Both of those celebrations are every year. And we would encourage, check the website. We've got lots of events coming up this fall. So we hope to see you here.
Excellent. And thank you so much, Rob, for giving us a chance to come out and tour Woodville and learn something about this place.
Very good. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.